Hello, my name is Katie Blatnick-Gagne, and I am the Vice President for the Family and Consumer Sciences Division of ACTE. ACTE is the largest national education association of professionals dedicated to the advancement of career and technical education. In fact, ACTE has worked almost 100 years to help achieve policy victories and increase legislative activity around career and technical education. They work to develop robust professional development, grow partnerships through networks, and provide added member value, and nurture and culture recognitions of excellence, inclusion of members throughout the organization. ACTE has a wide variety of divisions that you can be a part of. Hopefully, you're all part of the Family and Consumer Sciences Education Division. If not, I invite you to join. You can also take part in things coming from administration, business education, health science education, and of course, work-based learning. ACTE has a high-quality CTE library. All of the resources available are online with the opportunity for you to either print or keep online versions. Share these high-quality resources out with your administrators and colleagues to help advance career and technical education into the future. One of my favorite opportunities in ACTE is to attend the premier professional development experience, ACTE's Career Tech Vision. This year's conference will be held in Las Vegas, Nevada, November 30th through December 3rd. I encourage you to join me in Las Vegas, not just to have fun on the Strip, but to also join in the conference, go to many workshops, and visit exhibitors within the expo area. And now on to our webinars. This is what you are here for today. We also have a wide variety of webinars that will be coming up, including academic esports, Be the Change through plant-based diets, and students with disabilities. Be sure to check out these offerings and our recorded webinar series that we have available online. Thank you for being here today. Enjoy the webinar and have a great rest of your day.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to your live event. My name is Eric Weinkoop, and I'm the Director of Culinary Instruction here at Ruby. And I'm also one of the chef instructors in the courses that we offer. Today's live event topic is a special one. I'm going to spend the next hour or so providing an overview, an introduction, a discussion on Indian cuisine. And the approach that I'm going to take is through the lens of history and culture, as those attributes shape significantly the Indian food that we see today, both in India, of course, but also overseas. I'm based in the U.S., and so I'll make reference to Indian cuisine that we experience through restaurants and even home cooking here. Okay, as I get started, I also want to give a special welcome to the ACTE high school culinary instructors that are in the audience today. The goal is to provide each of you some information, some context that you can take back to your classroom or your teaching lab and share with your students as you discuss and you study Indian cooking with your students. Okay, and without further ado, let's go ahead and start in on the slide presentation today. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and you start out with some data as I provide a little bit more context to my introduction here. I've been lucky enough over the years to make several trips to India and to travel around the country. My home base, I'll say, has been in the state of Maharashtra, and specifically in the city of Mumbai, which is on the west coast of India. And I've also had the opportunity to conduct some funded food research on two occasions in India. The first time as a Fulbright scholar, and the second opportunity through support from the Art Institute of Portland here in Oregon, where I was a faculty member for just shy of a decade, both in the culinary arts department and the liberal arts department, where I taught food anthropology. And India is a place that's near and dear to me. My spouse is also from India, and so I have an extensive network of kin in the Maharashtra area. And as we start out to talk today, I want to share some really basic points just to sort of situate India in your mind. All of these factors also touch upon the food culture as well. Okay, so located in South Asia and often referred to as the Asian subcontinent, uh, India is a big country. It's about one third the size of the United States by area, and it's got a population of just shy of 1.5 billion, second only to China, just by a little bit in its population. And due to its relatively smaller size, it's got some high population density, as you can probably imagine. And as you travel about India, just about wherever you go, certainly in any big cities, medium cities, smaller towns, and villages, you see people out and about at all hours of the day. It's just an exciting place, teeming with life. India's got a number of neighbors, some of which are more outspoken and are in the news with some frequency, and others are more quiet. But starting from the western side, we've got Pakistan, and then sharing a long northern frontier is China. And tucked in between China and India, nestled up in the Himalayas, is Nepal. And then further east is Bhutan. And then as you take the turn south and southeast, we go past Myanmar or Burma. And then also in that area is Bangladesh. And then farther south, down the east coast, is the island nation of Sri Lanka, not too far off of the Indian mainland. Okay, India is also significantly the home of a number of major religions. Hinduism, which is the primary religion in India, and then Buddhism, which now is very much a minority religion in India, instead having taken on popularity through much of the rest of Asia. There's also Sikhism and Jainism that are some of the, again, primary religions that that had their birth in India. Regarding political divisions, there are 28 states and 8 union territories. The union territories generally tend to be smaller geographic areas, with the exception of Jammu and Kashmir in the far, far north of India. But all the union territories are administered by the national government in Delhi. And, India has 23 official languages, but closer to 400 or so languages in total as we look at many of these smaller regional populations. And then vegetarianism accounts for this is about 30% of the population, and most of those folks are going to identify as Hindus. All right. Um, Now I'm going to test your geography a little bit, okay, as I continue to situate India in the world. This is going to be important as we think about forces or influences that have played out upon the food culture in India, and what we see currently in restaurants in the U.S. as well as on tables in India. Okay, and so India again is sometimes referred to as the subcontinent, and if you look at the Asian continent, we can see that India resides right along the center line but sort of hangs down. Um, and it's an appendage of sorts from the Asian mainland. And running across the northern border, kind of at an angle, from northwest to southeast, is the Himalaya mountain range. And significantly here, if we go back a few thousand years and we think about the Silk Road and the network of trade routes over land that make up the so-called Silk Road, we can draw a continuum basically from the Mediterranean basin. And so if you look at the African continent, just north of Africa, that body of water, that's the Mediterranean Sea. And so that whole area around that, including North Africa and Europe, is the Mediterranean basin. And to the east of the Mediterranean is Turkey. And from Turkey, the so-called gateway to Asia, we have the Silk Road overland routes that took people and ideas and products back and forth to China. And so it went, among other routes through Persia, modern day Iran, up through the Stans. And if we follow the countries in the direction of India, we've got Turkey, we have Iran, we have Afghanistan, and then Pakistan before we get to Northwest India. And then north of there, we've got Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, and some of the other stands, as they're sometimes referred to as. And the Silk Road then went further east through Urumqi in Muslim Western China, and then farther toward the eastern regions of China. And so if you, again, get Asian mainland, India is positioned uh, right smack dab in the middle of all action. There were routes that dropped south from the main trunk lines into India, um, to bring, in and out of there spices and dried fruits and nuts, and it eventually textiles and again ideas and people as well. And then, as part of the Silk Road, uh, um, there is a network of maritime trade routes. And it, very early on, the maritime trade routes were characterized by activity performed by Arab traders. And so those Arab traders originated in what would be different countries today around the Arabian Peninsula, ranging from the kind of the northeast corner of Africa through the Red Sea down toward the Horn of Africa, and then on the other side of the peninsula along the Persian Gulf. And so those traders, again, thousands of years ago, plied the coastline up the east coast of Africa, down the west coast of India, up the east coast of India, and then down the coast of Myanmar and into Malaysia and what is Indonesia today, and then even up north from there into the Philippines and Vietnam and the east coast of China. And that was a very busy pathway and lots of commercial activity. And once again, India was situated right smack dab in the middle of that maritime trade. And so, whether it was nutmeg or mace coming out of Indonesia, that stuff found a home in India, consumers, and then eventually um, propagation there as it made its way through the Middle East and then into the Mediterranean basin and the consumers in Europe. Now, as a lot of us are aware, it was those emerging European colonial superpowers that wanted to bypass the Arab traders and the high prices that they were charging. And so that's when the Europeans set sail to find a direct route to India. And probably the best known example is Christopher Columbus. And as we know, he quickly got lost and ended up in the Americas. And then just a few years after that, in 1498, Vasco da Gama. He left Portugal, came down the west coast of Africa and around the Cape of Good Hope, and then up the east coast of Africa, and then eventually to the west coast of India, okay, into modern day Kerala. And so that's how a lot of the early trade took place that started to move food, ingredients from one place to another around the globe. And so things in India, most notably spices, moved out of the region, and many ingredients, um, uh, nuts and fruits and cooking methods moved into India overland from the northwest, and ingredients came in over the ocean ways as well. Okay, this next slide here takes us and gives us a close up of India, and I mentioned Kerala, which is in southern India on the west coast. It's colored blue, and that's where Vasco da Gama originally landed. And it wasn't long before the Portuguese set up a trading post, which morphed into a colony in Goa, just north of there, kind of pinched between Maharashtra and Karnataka. And Goa, interestingly, remained a Portuguese colony for about 400 years until 1961. And so until some pretty modern times here. The Portuguese also had some outposts farther north on the Indian west coast. If you take a look at the small print, you can see Daman and Diu and Dadra and Nagar Haveli. Those were also Portuguese colonies, Portuguese ruled until about 1961. Now, in the meantime, other French colonial or other European colonial powers came to India, including France. And just as a side note, I'll mention that on the east coast of this map of India, you can see some dots with circles around them, and with the name Pondicherry or Pondicherry. Though there are four of them, three on the east coast, and then there's a fourth Pondicherry in Kerala. All four of those were under French control for a period of time. The British finally took them after a battle, and that marked greater British influence in the subcontinent. And so the British eventually encroached, intensifying their trade and commercial activities, until they were a dominant force in India for a period of time as well. Okay, so it's just a little bit of a historical snapshot, in terms of some of the different overlays of influence from the early Arab traders, even predating Islam, into the more, I'll call it relatively modern era, right, of European colonialism, with a number of players vying for commercial interests in India. So in this next slide, I want to mention very briefly that the influences very significantly on the cuisine include the trade partners through time, as well as conquerors and the various religions that find their home in India, as well as the geography, of course. And these are common themes as we study food and food culture across the world. Okay, and I do want to emphasize that. And as we move forward with today's talk, I also want to uh, preface the following slides by saying that India, as I alluded to earlier, is just an incredibly interesting, diverse, sort of intense food environment. And as you look at the various regions and 20 states and sub-regions within the states, they each boast their own food culture. Um, and as you move a few kilometers in this direction or the other direction to the next town or village, you can start to notice changes in the food um, patterns and the foods that are available. But the climate changes, moving from coastal areas inland, for example, and so um, along the way, you can pick up on subtle shifts in eating patterns, and certainly as you travel across larger distances, those differences become more magnified, and they're just easier to recognize. Okay, but as we talk about India, and if you look at the literature on Indian food, including a lot of the information online, you're going to see that some sources will divvy up India um, into the roughly northern region and the southern region and make broad comparisons. Others will divvy up India into quadrants, aligning with northeast, south, and western regions, and will try to sort of characterize the way people eat and live across those very broad areas. And now, while there are some patterns that can emerge, um, there's just a tremendous amount of nuance and variety. And so, as I talk about some of the structures or some of the framework by which you can approach Indian cuisine, please understand that in between the lines that we talk about here is just so much variation, from village to village, and certainly from household to household, and, and especially in this contemporary, globalized era that we live in today, where the movement of finances and ideas and things like food, right, as well as people, is very intense. And people in India have connections all over the world due to immigration and uh, the global Indian diaspora. So, again, just kind of keep that in mind as I introduce some of these things to consider as you start to analyze and study recipes and approach Indian food in your own way. Okay. And so, on this slide, I want to again just introduce some basic overlays of influence or culture that still have an imprint on food and food culture today. And so I mentioned the Arabs. Coffee, as many of you probably know, is said to have originated in Eastern Africa, in what is today Ethiopia, and that um, product made its way north, into the Arabian Peninsula, and eventually the traders carried that product into India. Such that today, while the entirety of India enjoys a tea culture, um, the southern regions of India have a notable coffee culture as well. And that's been in place for a long time. And I will say that, in the more contemporary era, let's say the last century or so, coffee shops in these southern areas of India have been associated with the intelligentsia, the literati. They were places for people to gather to consider, how they might oust the British, and so on and so forth. And so these coffee shops play an important role in the history of these regions as well as the social development. And then, if we take a look at today's contemporary culture, especially in the urban centers, we'll see that there is a coffee shop culture much akin to Starbucks. And, the shops that I have frequented and enjoyed tend to be domestic Indian corporations. but they again are generally like Starbucks in terms of their feel, and those sort of dot the urban centers of India today. Moving down the list to the Portuguese. The Portuguese are credited with introducing significant ingredients from the New World, and namely tomatoes, potatoes, chilies, and corn. And these are all from Mesoamerica. Think about modern day Mexico. These are as well as areas of northern South America in terms of the potato. But these, especially the first three, tomatoes, potatoes, and chilies, are staple foods in Indian cuisine and food culture today. I mean, I can't imagine a meal absent these three ingredients. I mean, just imagine Indian food without chilies. And then also imagine that as little as 500 years ago, these ingredients were absent. Instead, the pungent flavors were coming from ginger, from black peppercorns, and from piper longum or long pepper. These are all still commonly used in India, but overshadowed by the beautiful capsaicin heat of chilies from the New World. Corn. We often don't think about corn in India, but corn is a common grain that is grown, especially in the interior, in these more arid regions that are not rice growing regions. And corn then appears commonly in the form of a flour, ground flour, along with wheat and sorghum and a few varieties of millet to make up staple carbohydrates in the diet of Indians. And these are, corn is something that doesn't appear on restaurant menus, for example, in the US very often at all. I associate it more closely with home cooking, where so much of the beautiful food of India still resides. Under the British, we have the tea culture, which was brought from China to India as the British set up tea plantations. Today, tea is grown in southern India and all the way up into the northeast regions. And those plantations are often referred to as tea gardens, and they are indeed beautiful places. Nicely manicured bushes, bright green in color, contrasting against the brown walkways, the dirt pathways in between the bushes, and against the nice blue skies that you often see in these areas. And then the last item, Chinese influence on food is very interesting and quite significant. China, as I mentioned earlier, shares a long land border to the north, and has also had contact via the maritime routes with India for a very long time. And significantly, once Buddhism came about, say 2,500 or so years ago, and was enthusiastically exported and taken up in China and beyond, Chinese monks came to India to study, and that really began an intensification of exchange between India and China around a lot of different subjects. Certainly, spirituality and literacy, around the written word, texts for monks to study, and food is part of that as well. What we see today is that. Um, Chinese food is enjoyed across the country, especially in urban areas, and we see its influence on Indian restaurant menus in the US as well today. But these Chinese dishes, referred to as Indian Chinese, or sometimes Chinese Indian or Chindian dishes, um, are notably Indian, in their style, but Chinese in their inspiration. They're dishes that you probably are not going to find in China, although they're characteristically Chinese, in a certain way, but with more ginger and more chilies and garlic and sort of massaged and twisted in a way to really fit the Indian palate. And so, if you have a chance to try out some of these Indian Chinese dishes at a restaurant, please give them a try. It's a refreshing twist on Chinese inspired dishes. All right, next up, um, the conquerors. And, arguably there have been a number of conquering parties, or groups to come into India, especially overland, over a very long period of time, most notably through Central Asia and in through Northwest India. And very early on, there were Turkic groups that traveled a long distance to get to India. And Alexander the Great made it there in 321 BC. But most notably, it's the Mughals that left their imprint on the culture significantly in the northern regions of India and very much so in the food of today. And the Mughals are Central Asian Muslims with a connection to Persia, modern day Iran. And, in terms of their conquest of India, that started in the early 1500s and stretched into the mid 1800s. Um, and, among other things, the characteristics that they left on the food are a strong dairy culture, noted by heavier, richer sauces that envelop some very beautiful preparations, many of which are meat dishes. And then also, those folks brought in nuts and fruits, and especially dried fruits that they introduced to some classic Indian preparations. Um, and if we think about these regions of Central Asia, many of them are temperate. They enjoy higher altitudes. And so we see walnuts and pine nuts and almonds, as well as apples and cherries and figs that were brought into the northern reaches of India in particular. And, those things today are grown in what are the foothills of the Himalayas and in these somewhat cooler and temperate climate zones. And this very last line I have for you on this particular slide is just a short list of some examples that are attributed to the Mughals. So, some of these rich baked or fried pastries, many of which are stuffed. In the case of the samosa, with potato, vegetable, spice fillings, and sometimes with a minced meat filling. And then also beautiful rice dishes, the pilaf or pulao, a classic dish from Persia. And its sort of upscale, more fancy cousin, the biryani. And the biryani historically has been associated with the grand banquets of the privileged classes. And in more modern society, a family might enjoy biryani to celebrate somebody's birthday or to mark some other special occasion, such as a graduation from school. And so a biryani could take some time to prepare with its layers of vegetables and oftentimes meat, and the addition of many spices and blossom waters to add some additional layers of beautiful aroma to the finished dish. And there are many different styles of biryani that have emerged in both northern India as well as southern India and points in between. But the common denominator is that, at least historically, they have tended to be associated with the Muslim communities and the Muslim royal um, houses or ruling classes. Today, of course, they're enjoyed by anybody. And here in the US, we're seeing biryanis offered more and more commonly at Indian restaurants, especially some of the regional um, menus that are being featured. And so, we can easily, um, you spend 20 or $25 and enjoy biryani every week if we wanted to, which on one hand is fantastic because it's delicious food, but on the other hand, it's a little bit unfortunate because the celebratory nature is lost, right? When these special foods come to be consumed too frequently. Regarding religions, um, again, I'm going to provide just a sort of a high level historical, maybe traditional, call it orthodox connection between these primary religions that we find in India and some of the rules around food associated with each. Okay. Hindus are known for abstaining from beef consumption. And, as I mentioned early on in today's talk, approximately 30% of the country identifies as vegetarian. And that's going to be most closely aligned with the Hindu majority population. Muslims avoid pork, and Buddhism is associated with vegetarianism. And this is a general affiliation. Historically, Buddhist monks have notably made an exception, especially during times of illness, where they were permitted to eat the flesh of animals, believing that they would get greater nutrition to help in the healing process. But still, vegetarianism is, in a significant way, in India as well as outside of India, associated with vegetarian practices. The Jains, um, many Jains will avoid root vegetables because their goal is to avoid the killing of any life, including little critters that might be attached to root vegetables. And then notably here, um, Jains, as well as some Hindu Brahmins, will avoid onion and garlic consumption because onions and garlic are associated with stirring up the energies within the body and heating up the body, which is associated with enhanced carnal desires. And the uh, some of the Hindu Brahmins, at least some of the subcastes, associate a more refined lifestyle with their station in society, at least historically, and so they have opted to avoid onions and garlic. And there are pockets of Christians, Christian communities throughout the country and generally speaking, the Christian population does not have proscriptions like the Hindus or like the Muslims might. Now, as I share this general overview, I also want to emphasize that there are plenty of exceptions to all of these guidelines that I have just mentioned. I have met many Hindus that will enjoy a hamburger here in the U.S. I've got Muslim friends that enjoy pork, and Buddhists that have butchered animals, and so on and so forth. So, again, while these might be general trends, sort of ideals that might be more true among Orthodox devotees of these religions, there are plenty of exceptions among individuals. Okay. And then regarding the geography, as with anywhere in the world, the topography and where people live in conjunction with the land definitely shapes what they eat, what they have access to, what they might trade, and overall how the food culture develops. In the case of India, um, it has well over 7,000 kilometers of coastline, which means that seafood cooking traditions abound in much of India. Now, interestingly, when I visit Indian restaurants here in the US, I see very, very few seafood dishes on the menu. For example, if there are 40 dishes on the menu, I might see four seafood items. And it's unfortunate because so many beautiful preparations are associated with these coastal traditions. And they include finfish and shellfish, as well as a robust coconut economy. And the coconut economy means that many people in these villages who manage coconut groves and harvest the products make a livelihood from it. And in some cases, they are um, selling the coconuts whole for consumers to enjoy the water, so coconuts as a beverage. Um, the coconuts might be sold at a fairly young point, shortly after harvest, so that the soft, succulent meat can be enjoyed in certain preparations. And in some cases, they're split open and dried, and so that this cobra, as it's called, at least in some areas, is sold. It has a long shelf life, and then it can be grated and then incorporated into dishes as needed. You can also add some water and blend it. Use coconut milk, and then, of course, from the trees of the coconut palms, um, you can harvest building materials for houses, for walls and roofs. And then also, at least in my experience in coastal areas, there's also a tradition of producing alcoholic beverages called toddy from the sap and the water of the coconut blossom. And in those places where you're lucky enough to come across the toddy tappers, those that tap into the blossoms, you can just take your own bottle. Maybe it's a 1.5 liter, empty water bottle. Have them fill it up with this coconut elixir of sorts, this water, and it's refreshing. It's light on the palate. It's got a touch of sweetness, and anyone can enjoy it immediately. But as it sits throughout the day, it continues to ferment. And so, if you want a little touch of effervescence from the fermentation in midday, you can enjoy the beverage then. Or if you want a little more of a buzz in the evening, just hang on to your bottle for a few more hours, and you can enjoy a very nice beverage. And India is also home to major rivers as well as secondary rivers and lakes. And so there's a tradition around freshwater seafood, both finfish and shellfish. And probably most notable in terms of regions would be the eastern area of India in what is today the state of West Bengal. And if we erase the border for just a moment and kind of look at the country of Bangladesh and the state of West Bengal in India as a single region for a moment, that whole area sits on what's often called the Gangetic Delta. And it's a massive area that is made up of the delta from the river Ganges and the Brahmaputra River. Um, and all those uh, fresh waterways then have been the source of food, nutrition, and so much more for the people of that region. And in terms of Indian food culture, the state of West Bengal, you get the city of Kolkata, and many of the classic preparations um, are going to focus on freshwater fish as well as rice cultivation. So a lot of rice and vegetables are grown in the rich soils of the Gangetic Delta of eastern India. And if we move away from the coastal areas into the inland of India, much of the interior consists of what's called the Deccan Plateau. And now, along both the east and west coasts are the coastal ranges. And then once we get over the Western Ghats and the Eastern Ghats, we get into this hilly, overall higher elevation area, which is generally characterized by a relatively more arid climates, very hot in the summertime. This is where we have a lot of grains that are grown. Agriculture is um, uh, the driver of the economy. And this is where we find the wheat and corn and the sorghum and the millets that are grown, enjoyed as staple foods, as well as exported to other towns and cities outside of those areas. And then, of course, to the farthest northern reaches of India, is the foothills of the Himalayas, where, as I mentioned, nuts and temperate climate fruits are enjoyed. Um, the next few slides are going to focus on what I think of as really a framework or a structure for many Indian preparations. And if you can take a look at the information on these slides from a high level, so to speak, and understand that, for example, these common spices are enjoyed all across the country in the cuisines of every region of India, but in different proportions to characterize more strongly one region over another, for example, or those adjustments might reflect individual household preferences. But again, if you're considering setting up an Indian pantry of sorts, then consider these spices to begin with, certainly, and then you can add to this list depending on the recipes or the dishes that you want to produce, and just what it is specifically that you should have in your individual pantry. And then the last three items I've listed: ginger, garlic, and fresh chilies, often green chilies, are incorporated into dishes in their fresh form, very often as a paste or a puree. Okay. Chilies can be put in whole as well, but very often these are prepared as a paste or a puree, whereas the spices above, are used in their dried or semi-dried state that we would normally expect, spices to be presented in. I mentioned cooking oils here because, at least historically, some cooking oils or fats are more strongly associated with some regions of India. And, to this list, I would add sesame oil. It's non-toasted, just straight up sesame oil. India having a very, very long prehistoric sesame oil industry. But so today, just as we see in the United States and in so many regions of the world, these inexpensive refined oils are present everywhere. They tend to be inexpensive, and they're easy to use, right? They don't impart any flavor to the dish. Um, but these others, whether it's peanut oil, maybe moderately so, but certainly ghee, which is clarified butter, and mustard oil, coconut oil, and I mentioned sesame oil. These all have a more distinctive flavor, such that if a particular preparation, sort of in its more traditional form, calls for, say, mustard oil, it may be evocative of a West Bengal preparation, right? Or a dish from the state of Bihar, which is neighboring to the north and northwest of there. Coconut oil is used, in some regions, especially in some coastal areas, to characterize some of the regional cuisine flavor profile. Okay, but also understand that, with the movement of people and ideas and food products in this contemporary globalized era, we find people using really all of these different cooking fats, in a given region, as people modify their cooking styles and tweak a regional recipe. But again, do understand that with the flavors of these oils that permeate the dish, they can evoke the flavors of a particular regional cuisine profile. All right, and the next slide looks at souring agents. Um, Now, as many of us are aware of, right? Among all the tastes, um, at a very fundamental level, the sour taste is really important, and it is right there neck and neck with salt in terms of bringing interest to the palate. And therefore, we think about within the context of Indian cuisine, how we use souring agents, and lime juice and tamarind, kokum, which is sometimes called an Indian plum, is available semi-dried or dried, and then it's simmered in sauces and in a liquid medium to draw out its flavor, its sourness. Vinegar, said to have been introduced by the Portuguese, as well as amchur, green mango powder, and anardana, which is pomegranate seed in its ground or powdered form. Those are the classic souring agents that are used across the country. I'm sure there are others as we drill down deeper into some of the regional cuisine traditions. Okay, but these are common souring agents that I would recommend any cook be familiar with as you delve into Indian cooking. Okay, and the last two items with asterisks I have included um, because they impart a tanginess or a sourness as a secondary attribute to their function in dishes. Okay, in Indian cuisine, broadly speaking, leafy green vegetables play an important role. And we don't see them very much in the United States. Probably the classic preparation is palak paneer, and palak referencing in these specific recipe preparations spinach, but it can also include other leafy greens like mustard greens. Now, in the case of some of these more sour greens, an example is gongura. Gongura appears in some areas of southern and eastern India, and is a leaf akin to sorrel in its sourness, just to give you an example. And it's used as a vegetable primarily, but secondarily, it lends sourness to a dish. So it helps balance some of the other heavy, earthy elements in the dish. And then yogurt plays a special role in the Indian kitchen, where it is often used as a marinade and tenderizer for meat preparations, and then also is used as the body itself for certain preparations. So there's as an example, a category of preparations called kadi, which is yogurt that is thickened and stabilized with besan, which is chickpea flour. And then to that, you'll add green chili and spices and often other vegetables to create this yogurt-based dish. Now, in that context, yogurt is used as the body of the dish, but secondarily, you can offer the tanginess of yogurt to play through to the end. Okay, hence the asterisk on those last two items. Okay, moving right along. When we think about building Indian dishes, um, what is sometimes referred to as a thickening agent, or maybe more broadly could be understood as making up the body of the dish, its saucy component, often referred to as gravy by Indian people, um, consists of onion or tomato or a bell pepper puree. And it could be a combination of those, or they could be used singularly. And certainly there are other examples too, but these are some common examples that you're bound to come across. Coconut puree is also used, and this is where you might use grated coconut and, as it's combined with the spices and other, aromatics, it's then put into a blender, to further, make that smooth in consistency, and then, added to or added back to the pot, to continue cooking. Lentils, are an important ingredient that, add to the body or the thickness of a preparation such as dal. And then, um, in the same category is gonna be the besan or chickpea flour. And as I mentioned, a classic, example is gonna be the category of dishes called kadhi, where besan is added to yogurt as a thickener and stabilizer, for that yogurt-based preparation. And then there are also nut and seed pastes, and I've listed a few common examples. And these can be used singularly or in combination with some others here. But they're all fairly commonly used throughout the country. And once again, as you travel and drill down into some interesting regional preparations, you're bound to come across other examples. So please keep an open mind to those. Now, next, I want to provide a basic sort of framework or structure of building many dishes, okay, in the Indian repertoire. And not all dishes will follow this structure, but it is fairly common. And so as you start to investigate recipes, you'll probably start to recognize uh, some form of this structure being present. And step one is to fry whole spices in oil to draw out the flavors into the oil. And then the oil itself will sort of permeate the dish and the other ingredients to spread those spicy flavors throughout. Number two, the body ingredients that you're working with. So, for example, onion puree would be combined with, I have written GGC, but looking down below, the ginger garlic chili, right, in their fresh paste form. Because those things burn pretty easily on their own, they're combined with the moisture of pureed onion and then cooked together. Um, After which, if you're using a tomato puree, that would be added. But the tomato is optional, it just depends on the preparation. Okay. And after that cooks, for a few minutes. Step three, you're going to add your main ingredients, which are commonly vegetables or some sort of a meat that's often been marinated or prepped in some fashion. And then at that point, you're going to do some more simmering, and the dish might be done. Okay, after step three. Now, for some richer heavier, sorts of preparations, you might go into steps 4 and 5, right? Where a nut or seed paste is then added. That's cooked down a little bit, and then the whole pot is gonna be finished with the addition of more spices that have been bloomed in oil, again, to draw out the flavors of the spices, That is then poured over the top of the finished dish, sometimes served like that, but other times gently folded in, nonetheless, sort of folded in just prior to service. And that's referred to as forni or tadka. And so step 5 is much like step 1, right, in terms of drawing out the spice flavors. Step 1 provides a foundation, right, that's allowed to cook for a longer period of time, whereas the step 5 addition of spice flavor gives you that last minute finishing hit of fresher toastiness on the palate. Okay, so think about this structure as you investigate Indian recipes. Okay, again, it applies to many dishes, although not all of them, of course. And sweets, right? We think of them as desserts in the US, but sweets more broadly. There is an incredible array of sweets that come from all regions of India. And note that most of them are going to be served at room temperature or even warm. And the typical exception is going to be kulfi. And kulfi is a frozen dessert that has a Muslim heritage. And so it reigns from the high elevations of the Central Asian, cooler areas. And a kulfi, I mean, kind of like ice cream, right, is a frozen dessert, but it's not churned. It's just a set frozen dessert, often flavored with fruits or nut purees like pistachio, or it could be reduced milk or cream for a nice richness. And these are based on many different ingredients, different meaning different from what we might see in the Euro-American tradition. Some examples include ras malai, which is a dairy-based preparation, in this case based on paneer, that is presented in a condensed milk sauce flavored with pistachio nuts and cardamom and saffron. Soan papri is kind of a sponge sugar sort of a preparation that's based on besan, which you might remember as chickpea flour, so a variation on legumes. Carrot halva is a very popular preparation based on vegetables, grated carrots, cooked with some sugar, some ghee, some spices, and jalebi, which is based on a fried batter, and then soaked in um, kind of a high density syrup, a simple syrup, and then katsu katli, in this case based on cashews, but there are certainly many, many other nut-based sweets. Okay, and we see some of these here in the U.S., especially where there are Indian communities in places like Chicago and in New Jersey and the suburbs of Vancouver, BC. And you can enjoy these traditional Indian sweets, and I hope that you will check them out. They are beautiful to look at, and they are tasty and just really interesting, and kind of a fun area of food to investigate. And then, lastly is the service style. We certainly see ceramic plates and spoons and even forks that might be used. And if you're in a Western dining context, a knife, would be a part of that as well. But in a traditional setting, Indian food is served on what's called a thali, which is basically a round plate, kind of a large format round plate. They come in different sizes, however, with small bowls set on the plate. All of your menu items are presented at once around the periphery with rice typically featured in the center. And then you would enjoy that with your right hand. Okay. And while we might typically come across a thali, the plate itself, that service is referred to as thali, and the plate itself is referred to as thali. And typically, it's going to be made of metal of some sort. but there are certainly areas where you might see a banana leaf that's used, and the food's presented in a very similar manner to what you would see on a thali. And in areas where you don't have coconut or but banana leaves rather, um, you will see the use of banyan tree leaves. And so anyway, that's an old tradition of some biodegradable serviceware. All right. And so thank you very much. This brings to conclusion the slide portion of the talk today. What I want to do next is kind of shift over to some of the questions. And I see that there is a nice list of questions that you populated the right-hand side of the screen with here. I'm gonna get to just a subset of these, okay? And then the remainder of these, I will respond to offline, just privately. And then certainly, if you wanna continue this conversation at all, feel free to reach out to me, at support@rouxbe.com. Okay, remember that Ruby is spelled Rouxbe. All right. So let's start with the first one. And this is from Adair. Hello, Adair. It's been a long time. Hope you've been well. Um, when making vegan palak paneer using tofu instead of paneer, is there a trick for getting tofu to have a paneer-like chewiness instead of just a mushiness? So this is an interesting question. Um, I don't know if I have the perfect answer for you, Adair, but let me suggest a few things that come to mind. And of course, so much of a food's textural preference is individual. But the first one is to look for an extra firm tofu and see if that maintains that more dense chewiness that you're after. And I certainly understand that, as many styles of tofu heat up thoroughly, they become really soft inside. Um, Another thing to consider is once you dice the tofu to fry it uh, on each side in order to create a light crust, which adds a little bit of chewiness, a little bit of integrity to the dice of tofu. And that's going to give it a different mouthfeel and see how you might like that. And then the last thing that comes to mind is to consider a different type of tofu. It's a freeze dried tofu called koya tofu. And you'll find it in Japanese grocery stores. And see how you like that. The freeze drying process ends up giving the rehydrated tofu a different mouthfeel, a different texture. And just see how you might like that. Those are the ideas that come to mind. All right, thank you. Okay, and Aruna asks, what spices would you recommend to start a basic Indian pantry? Love Indian food. Looking forward to this event. Thank you so much for joining us, Aruna. And I'm going to refer you to that slide that I touched upon a few slides back. That will touch upon some of the more common spices that tend to appear across the country. And again, noting that um, a particular recipe that you want to experiment with may call for an additional spice or two or three, but that list will be a great place to start. Okay. And then the next one, also by Aruna. Do you have any tips on making Indian chapati or roti? I never seem to know what the texture of the dough is supposed to be like, and I can't roll around rotis. Okay. Yeah, this is a fun question. It's a challenging one because texture is difficult to describe, right? Now, as with, you know, dough in general, chapati dough should be well hydrated, thoroughly hydrated, not sticky, right? But it should be soft. And then, as you portion it out to, your whatever your individual weight might be based upon the size that you want, some folks will use flour when rolling it out, and then some folks use oil. And so, give it a try either way to see uh, which one you might prefer, which might be easier to handle. Um, and then also, at home here, the rolling pin that we use for chapatis is a little bit thicker in the center, and then it tapers a little bit toward the end. And so, as you're rolling, um, uh, the dough tends to rotate on its own, which is helpful in creating that ideal round shape, okay? Now, the other part of that is it takes a lot of practice, okay? Um, People like, my mother-in-law have made, I don't know, maybe 1,000,000 of, these chapatis in her lifetime, and with ease, right? She produces, round, consistent diameter, chapatis at each mealtime. But for many cooks that are just starting to make this type of flatbread on a regular basis for their family, this is indeed the challenge. And so it's practice, and it's also mindful practice, so that you can see how the dough shifts and moves with each movement of the rolling pin, and to move that rolling pin from the center to the edge and back again, adjusting the pressure. Okay, but do give that a try. Okay, and expect to roll out many, many more chapatis, all of them better than the last one. All right. Okay. Um, let's see. The next question from Michael. Please discuss Curry 101 as in origin, types, how grown and processed. Okay. So, interesting question here. Let me try to tease this apart a little bit into maybe two sub questions. Okay. And the word that sort of got my attention here is grown. Okay. On one hand, we have a plant, an herb, okay, called curry leaf. And curry leaf provides a distinctive flavor, okay, to certain Indian dishes. And in India, you commonly find curry leaf fresh at the market, or um, um, sold by street side vendors. And then around here, um, we'll find curry leaves fresh at the market. And if they're left over, you can easily dry them and then use them in the same manner. A common way to use curry leaves is to fry them, with spices, either in that first step or that fifth step, right, that I mentioned on that earlier slide, in order to draw out those aromatic oils to add a unique earthiness to the dish. Note, however, that the dried version has much less flavor than the fresh. Okay, but do be careful if you're using the fresh version, because the oil will splatter much more from the moisture that's present. Okay. Now, otherwise, when I see the word curry, I think about this category of wet preparations. At least within this the English language context. Maybe not just English, but let's focus on the U.S. here, right? Where when we think about Indian food, people always, or not always, but often, think about curry. Um, and so, curry comes from a Tamil word meaning sauce. And so, generally speaking, when we use the term curry, like, hey, let's go get a curry, or let's make some curry, we're referring to a preparation that has a sauce or a gravy component. So it's got some wetness to it, as a style of preparation. But they can vary tremendously, okay, in terms of the ingredients and even, the base ingredients of those sauces, all right? The term curry was popularized by the British. In India, you sometimes hear the word curry or curry used, but more often than not, the dish that's being referenced has its own name. Um, and again, from let's say an American perspective, we might say, "Hey, that looks like curry," but the Indian cook might call it something else more specific, to their regional language. Okay. Um, in terms of curries, I'll mention a couple of sort of real broad distinctions. A lot of these preparations will call for dried spices in the form of a blend, right? Some sort of a masala blend, masala meaning spice. In some areas of southern India, there's a tradition of using a wet spice blend. And so you might, combine some dried spices, but then also incorporate that to make a paste along with uh, ginger, garlic, chilies, and lemongrass, and maybe some other things, akin to some of the wet curry pastes that we associate with Southeast Asian cuisine. And this is one of those um, uh, sort of threads that link this area of southern India with the regions of Southeast Asia, through climate and geography, as well as many, many years of trade, okay, as knowledge and products move back and forth, okay? So, Michael, I hope that helps in terms of thinking a bit about what a curry might mean, what that could be. It's a very general term used more in English. An exception would be in Japanese, where curry was introduced in the 1800s by British sailors, and today, kare rice, curry rice, is a very, very common food in Japan, both at home as well as in restaurants. And so the word curry in that context has entered the Japanese language. Okay. And then next up, um, let's see here. Let me just take one more question. Okay, I want to be respectful of everyone's time here, and we're already going into some overtime here. But this next one is by Davey, who asks, "What's a whole food plant-based substitute for coconut milk in Indian food recipes?" So, interesting question. Let me first say that if you want to focus on, plant-based cooking, then certainly coconut milk fits the bill, right? Um, if you want something that's a little bit more whole, in its state of processing or having been processed, then rather than coconut milk from a can, let's say, you might use grated coconut, which is gonna have more of the fiber of the coconut present. And then that can be pureed, blended, and then otherwise incorporated into a recipe, okay? With water or whatever the liquid, usually water, might be in order to create, the coconut milk sort of a body that you might be looking for, okay? Um, yeah, but I mean, otherwise, Yeah, coconut milk is going to be from the plant. Okay. So let's go ahead and bring to a conclusion. Okay, the Q&A session at this point. As I mentioned earlier, I will follow up with you individually for the questions that are currently posted. And then also, if you would like to continue this discussion in your own context, whether it's your, concerning your students in the lab or some experimenting in your home kitchen, I'm happy to have a discussion. Please reach out to me at support@ruby.com. Okay. And in the meantime, I wish you all a very flavorful and happy cooking. Thank you very much.